Ted Blom, I mean, Germany is at the cutting edge of so much of the tech and so many of the opportunities. Here in South Africa, we're way behind the curve. 12 years into our energy crisis, we're still deep in a crisis, and many countries north of our borders are in deeper mess than we are. Crisis, yes. Opportunity, enormous. How do you read it?
So I really think that if you ignore just the South African paradigm for the moment, because that is fraught with political obstacles, just outside our borders, there's 10 times bigger opportunity than the opportunity in South Africa. And these are countries that I've traversed quite well over the last 30, 40 years. And really, they are crying out for energy. Energy is the key ingredient for economic development. People are tired of living in the third and the fourth world, and they all now see energy as the gatekeeper to a very prosperous future. So yes, I think that the opportunities are around, and I think they've matured now, and I think people are hungry for the solutions. And really, I think certainly in the medium term, this is going to open up a lot of competition, which actually is, as you all know, very good for getting prices down to affordable levels.
Yeah, the huge knock-on effects are felt throughout the entire economy. I mean, Bhavtik, it does come down then to very significantly the choices that policymakers make, not only in South Africa, but in other countries too across this continent.
Absolutely, Bruce. I think, unfortunately, you need things to go wrong first before they come right. And I think it's exactly that when you have, power shocks to the system, you have blackouts or you have load shedding that actually forces or jolts government into action. Now, what we've seen in South Africa, clearly we've got the integrated resources plan, which is government's energy plan for the next, several years up until 2030. There's a very clear shift in there where we are clearly moving away from over-reliance on coal to diversifying our energy mix to include renewable energy, to include gas-fired power generation, etc. Right? So I think the future, when you look at Eskom, I mean, the bulk of Eskom's generation fleet is actually coal-fired. The average age of the fleet is well in excess of 28 years. And the reality is that old fleet is inefficient, is expensive to run. And I think the positive story from that is, a government is actually going to be rolling out through Eskom, through IPPs, a number of IPPs to generate, the more capacity that we actually need, right? So we are, a country blessed with a lot of natural resources, a lot of mining and metals, and we need to beneficiate more. But in order to entice international companies and mining entities to actually beneficiate those metals in the country, you need cheap, reliable access to power. And that is really the precursor to actually getting industry growing again in South Africa, to creating jobs and fostering industrialization. So yes, I think in many respects that will come. But in many respects, South Africa also leads the way as to what happens in the region, right? So Ted spoken earlier about, the size of the opportunity set. If you take energy storage, it is still very new globally. But I think this emergency power program that we're currently running, where we are seeing a lot of internationals trying to deploy energy storage, will in many senses be the leading indicator of what is to come in many parts of the region, and indeed Southern and the rest of Africa.
I wonder if you agree with Ted Blom when it comes to, and I think this is what Ted was talking about, just talking about the whether or not the huge state-owned utilities as we know them, Eskom being the biggest, I think, on the continent, is relevant and fit for the future. I know the South African government has, been talking for years, and Andre de Ruyter, the chief executive at Eskom, is talking about chopping it up into the three component parts, which may extend the life term of a holding company at the helm of these three bits and pieces. But I wonder if we're just not so far beyond that already. Okay,
so I think that as far as Eskom is concerned, when I worked there 30 years ago, it was already divisionalized. I could tell you SBU, and that is Strategic Business Unit for unit. I could tell you the exact cost structure, the monthly cost, the budgets, the cost of each employee, etc. So for the argument that breaking Eskom up will lead to greater transparency, it's a fool's paradise. And I think that Eskom, as we know it, in any way, is irrelevant for the future because 2 years ago at the conference in Cape Town, I forecast that the future would be for most businesses and households would be microgrids. In fact, I've done a lecture to the regulator on that about 5 years ago. So they're expecting developments in that area. And certainly if it is done properly, it will be far more cost efficient than Eskom could ever hope to be. So Eskom will be left with two classes of customers. The one would be the very cost-sensitive industrial customers who are pulling their hair out and disinvesting because Eskom has ripped their profits out of their businesses. And secondly, the indigents who don't want to pay for electricity because they were made political promises. So yes, Eskom's future income stream is going to be under even more pressure than it has been over the last 10 years, which funded all the corruption and the misdemeanors and inefficiency. Even if they wipe that all out tomorrow, Eskom's future income stream is not what it's going to be in the past, and will start declining at a faster and faster rate.
Bhavtik, the obsolescence argument, where does that leave us then in terms of the future of energy provision on this continent?
Obsolescence, speaks to two or three things, Bruce. I think the one thing is, in the case of South Africa, we've got old plant. I wouldn't say it is in a sense kind of obsolete because they're old, they're inefficient, they're expensive to run, right? Eskom's coal-fired power generation fleet. I think the number, if I recall, is actually closer to 35 or 39 years is the average age of the fleet, right? And that clearly is inefficient, outdated, and expensive to run. But basically also the way the grid has actually been designed, if you go back a generation or so ago, the world over, transmission grids were actually designed for centralized transmission and generation of power, right? So essentially in South Africa, you have the coal fields in Limpopo and in Mpumalanga. And, from there, power generation actually occurs and is wheeled up to 2,000 kilometers all the way down to Cape Town, right at the bottom of Africa. Now, that is not ideal. The world's moved. Max spoke a little while ago about sort of, decentralized distribution. And clearly in South Africa, we still have a relatively high electrification rate. But if you look at what's, the situation outside of South Africa, where, generally in Africa, you have more than 600 million people that don't have access to reliable, affordable electricity. The only way you're going to get that electrification rate up is by having generation at specific load centers. And that speaks directly to, reformatting of the way the grid is designed, right? So you will have a generation plant, whether it is solar or renewable energy, etc., at a load center where power is required. It eliminates this need for long transmission distances and hence the transmission losses that actually come with, long distances. It's going to result in the whole evolving of the way the energy landscape will be looking going forward, and certainly requires redesigning of the grid completely from the old days in which Eskom was actually built and designed for, with centralized distribution.